Awesome. Thank you for joining today. All participants in this session have been automatically muted upon entry to the Zoom room. Feel free to unmute if you need to ask a question, but otherwise, please keep yourself muted if you are not speaking to limit any audio feedback that we have today. As I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, this session is being recorded, and I will be sending out a link to the recording of this presentation along with the slide deck and other relevant links and tools after we wrap up today. All right, let's get started. So the purpose of holding this engagement today was for two reasons. One was to provide some updates and clarity around the instructional materials process and what we have going on in instructional materials land at ODE. And the other is to give you an opportunity to virtually meet me and offer two-way communication as we work together to ensure that students have access to high quality instructional materials. I'm relatively new to this role. I started May 1st in the role of instructional materials coordinator, and I began at ODE in January, late January of 2020. So relatively new to the agency, but I have communicated with quite a few of you. If I haven't yet, I'm sure that I will in the near future, and I look forward to doing so. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end of this session, but feel free to use the chat feature if you have something that pops up on one of the slides that you need to ask and is relevant to the information being presented on the slide. I'm going to be monitoring the chat as I can to make sure that we do answer those questions in a timely manner for you. Today, we will be covering a range of topics. The first is just a general overview of the adoption process. We have two types of adoption under our Division 22 rules for instructional materials at ODE and in the state of Oregon. So we'll cover a general overview of what our adoption process is, as well as go a little bit into some specificity around the two different types of adoption that we have in Oregon. Another question that we'll answer today is the difference between basal materials and supplemental materials. This has been a point of confusion for a lot of districts and is rather vague in the administrative rule. So we'll go ahead and give a little bit of clarity around basal versus supplemental. I know a lot of you are here today to hear an update on the adoptions that we've recently performed and we are planning on performing in 2021. So we'll go ahead and cover the world languages adoption that we recently just finished up, as well as the ELA and English language proficiency adoption that we are beginning the process of starting with publishers. And lastly, we'll provide some information about our new open educational resource depository, Oregon Open Learning. The first thing that I wanted to do today was really ground us in the importance of high quality instructional materials. Access to high quality instructional materials are critical to excellent instruction, and instructional materials are a critical component of the instructional core. Research shows that students in general gain months of learning when teachers use stronger instructional materials. And high quality instructional materials help to ensure that there is coherence among grade levels. In many cases, the selection and adoption of high quality instructional materials is a critical first step to improving student learning. High quality instructional materials help to ensure that there's coherence among grade levels. And in many cases, I just said that. Selecting high quality materials is especially important for new teachers who may not have access to lessons to supplement unaligned or outdated materials. So ensuring that materials are up to date and they are currently meeting the adoption criteria set by the state board is especially important for teachers who might not have access to a library of materials that they created themselves to supplement traditional textbooks. And in a follow-up email after this engagement, I will provide access to a high-quality instructional materials research library. This is also going to be available on our new instructional materials toolkit page. This page was specifically designed to provide some resources to districts as they navigate the instructional materials process. And I just went ahead and dropped that link in the chat for you. So feel free either to click it open now to look at after this session, or it'll also be included in a follow-up email after we finish today. All right, so first we'll go ahead and start with an overview of what the instructional materials process is at ODE and on a state level. Here you can see a graphic that illustrates the adoption procedure that Oregon Department of Education and districts follow from year to year. As many of you know, Oregon is on a 7-year content area specific cycle for instructional materials. And this cycle usually follows the revision and adoption of new standards for a content area. So in this little Candyland typographic that we have going on here, you can see the flow, how we get from start to finish with the instructional materials process. And following this process and doing a comprehensive review of instructional materials helps to ensure the quality of instructional content that's being put in front of students. This process also establishes quality criteria, and we act as an independent third-party review when publishers submit their materials. And this system ensures that students are instructed using quality content that is aligned to standards, as well as aligned to the adoption criteria set by the State Board of Education. So the beginning of the cycle, you'll see that new standards are adopted. And in this scenario, we'll use mathematics as an example. Currently, mathematics standards in Oregon are being revised. As soon as they are adopted by the State Board of Education, that initiates the process for an instructional materials review. So in October, November, late fall of 2021, so this year, we will see the new standards. They'll be adopted by the state board, and we will begin the process for developing new adoption criteria. And this adoption criteria helps, again, to ensure that the content that's being in front of students is aligned not only to Oregon state standards for mathematics, but is aligned to current content and pedagogy standards within the field, as well as accessibility standards for print and digital materials. Moving into January of 2022 in this scenario, the State Board of Education would adopt the new criteria for evaluating instructional materials. And from there, it's 100 miles an hour until we get to the evaluation. We appoint our recruitment teams and we provide a comprehensive training for the evaluation teams to ensure that we have a common ground and foundation prior to evaluating the materials. That training often includes information about accessible educational materials, as well as grounding in a common foundation about our equity values at Oregon Department of Education, as well as in the state of Oregon. And this really provides us the necessary foundation that we need to do a comprehensive view of instructional materials. This training also has the technical aspect, what it means to review materials. In Oregon, we require that quality criteria documentation be submitted by publishers. And this quality criteria documentation serves as a roadmap for evaluators when they're looking at their materials compared to the adoption criteria. So we give them the information and the resources that our evaluators need to do a comprehensive review of the materials. Once our evaluation teams have come to a consensus on whether they would like to recommend the materials and whether they meet the scoring threshold that are set by our instructional materials evaluation tools, otherwise known as the IMET, then we take their recommendations and the scores that they have provided throughout their evaluation process. And in October of the adoption year, in the example of mathematics, that would be October of 2022, we take our recommendations to the State Board of Education, and the State Board often adopts the list of our recommended materials, and we begin the contracting process for our instructional materials adoption for that content area. In addition to the contracting, we often conduct what are called caravans. In-person caravans allow us to travel around the state. We work with publishers to have samples of materials that we can present to districts in person, often meeting at different ESD locations or a common location in different regions across the state. This year for world languages, which I know is one of the main reasons that many of you are here, for world languages, we will not be conducting in-person caravans due to COVID-19 and social distancing protocols. But for this reason, we are putting a lot of work into the digital caravan that we do every year. And these digital caravans include videos from the publishers outlining their materials and how they align and are beneficial to the content area being adopted. We expanded the parameters of our digital caravans a little bit this year so that publishers had an opportunity to provide more information to the districts and to interested parties looking at procuring these materials. So from there, once the district has had a chance to find a material or maybe multiple materials from the list that they're interested in procuring and purchasing, we move into the procurement process. And there are three options for instructional materials and being compliant with the Division 22 instructional materials rule. The first and often most streamlined of the three options is purchasing and implementing materials within 1 year off of the SBE approved list. So the list that is recommended by Oregon Department of Education. This list includes materials that we have been able to review and verify do meet the adoption criteria, as well as accessibility standards related to instructional materials. And this also includes a contracting process that the Department of Education goes through to ensure that the lowest possible retail price is available for districts throughout the length of the adoption period. And one of the ways that we do this is by working with Northwest Textbook Depository. Northwest Textbook Depository serves as a conduit in the procurement aspect or portion of purchasing materials and implementing materials. In the case that a district finds that they don't think that there are materials on Oregon Department of Education's list that meets their needs, they are welcome to conduct an independent adoption. And an independent adoption should be conducted and materials should be implemented within 1 year of the State Board of Education producing their list of recommendations. In the case that the independent adoption is not possible within that time frame, or in the case that potentially funding is not available to perform an adoption either from the list or an independent adoption process, the Division 22 process allows for a postponement period of up to 2 years. So you would, through Division 22, indicate that you are not compliant with the rule for instructional materials. And in that process, you would request the postponement form. That postponement form would be submitted to Oregon Department of Education and our Division 22 team. And from there, we would decide like, yes, this subject area is within the postponement window. We can approve the postponement, and the district would have a little bit more time to be able to procure and implement their instructional materials. I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second. How do you access the digital caravans? Great question, Jennifer. And the digital caravans for world languages are going to go live on Friday. So Friday morning for world languages, you'll be able to access a list of those videos from publishers. And the digital caravans for previous content areas are already listed on our adopted materials webpage. So I will make sure to include a link to the adopted materials webpage when I send a follow-up email after this session. And if you should be able to see the digital caravans from previous years, and starting on Friday, you will have access to the digital caravans for world languages. All right. So As I mentioned on the previous slide, a district really has two main options to be compliant with the administrative rule related to instructional materials for Division 22. And the Division 22 rule states that for each program and course in grades K through 12, each school district on a cycle established by the State Board of Education shall select and provide students with free, appropriate instructional and resource materials. These materials shall contribute to the attainment of the district, program, and course or grade level goals and reflect recent knowledge, trends, and technology in the field. So if you would like to remain compliant with your rule, you're going to want to pay close attention to the 7-year adoption cycle that's set by the State Board of Education. As I mentioned, world languages, we just completed that adoption and materials should be implemented by fall of this year. Districts have two options when procuring those materials. The first is going to be to purchase materials that were approved by Oregon Department of Education and recommended. That list can be found at the Adopted Instructional Materials webpage. There's an Excel spreadsheet that breaks down all of the submissions that we received through that review process, and it indicates whether or not they do meet the criteria or they do not meet. It also provides hyperlinks to the scoring sheets, so you can see the exact scores that were received by each material that was submitted by publishers. And you can also see price lists. So if you're interested in seeing why a material was recommended, go ahead and check out those score sheets. And if you are interested in looking at the procurement side and the price sheets that are available, you'll want to go ahead and access those price sheets. There's also updated information about the procurement side of instructional materials, as well as the pricing breakdown on Northwest Textbook Depository's website. And I will provide a link to that in the follow-up email today as well. If a district were to find that the materials that are on ODE's list do not meet their local needs, then they're going to want to conduct an independent adoption. And we'll go ahead and get into the independent adoption part now. So in order to give proper notification that an independent adoption is being made, the administrative head of a district must provide the district school board the information that's listed on this slide. So as you can see, basic information about the instructional materials, such as the copyright date, the publisher, etc., but also assurance statements. So a checklist that shows the degree to which proposed materials meet the criteria set by the State Board of Education, and keeping that checklist on file in the district office, as well as assuring that the materials being purchased comply with the current National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards and the manufacturing specifications for accessible instructional materials. And this is usually pretty simple. A publisher should have what is called a NIMAS assurance through NIMAC, which is the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Center. It's pretty common to have that assurance on hand. So when you implement the materials or you're inquiring about materials and getting samples while you're doing your review, you'll want to make sure that the publisher does have that NIMAS assurance. I see your question, Jennifer. Let's see. So the price list is what you would spend if you were to purchase through Northwest Textbook Depository or purchase through the publisher. The publishers have all signed contracts that indicate that the price list that we have on our Excel spreadsheet on the ODE website is stable and it will not change through the course of the adoption. In the case that you are going to purchase materials that have been recommended, and you are contacting the publisher directly and they're trying to sell you the materials at a higher price, my first step that I would recommend would be getting in touch with Northwest Textbook Depository. Let them do that contracting negotiation for you. Or you are welcome to send me an email and I'll go ahead and look into the contract and see why there is a price differential that is happening between the publisher and the district. And I'll get to your second question in one moment, Jennifer. So although no prior notice to Oregon Department of Education is required for an independent adoption, all of the requirements, the checkboxes on this slide, including proper notice to the local school board, must be fulfilled prior to implementing the materials in classrooms. So you're going to want to make sure that this process has been followed formally, and there's documentation of this process on hand at the district level prior to either purchasing the materials, but definitely prior to having them in front of students in the classroom. And the components on this slide must be presented to the local school board and, as I mentioned, kept on file at the district for the length of the adoption period. So as long as the materials are implemented in classrooms, you're going to want to have that checklist that shows that the materials meet the adoption criteria set by the State Board of Education. In the event that the adoption criteria changes, we enter a new adoption cycle and you'd still like to use the materials that have been implemented in classrooms, you'll want to restart that independent adoption process by making sure that the materials are aligned to the newest version of the adoption criteria. Independent adoptions should include a review of the materials by a robust evaluation team that includes teachers and content specialists. In addition to that, the district school board shall involve parents and citizens in the process of an independent adoption. This is important because as a state agency, we are not able to assure that independently adopted materials adequately meet the adoption criteria. The district must fulfill their due diligence of informing and collecting feedback from all necessary stakeholders to ensure that the materials are high quality and meet the needs of their local context. This is also why it's important to keep that documentation on file, illustrating that the district has formally conducted all parts of an independent adoption for the length of the adoption period. So in the case that you have a student and a parent that were in elementary school, they enter middle school and they have questions around the instructional materials being used, you'll have that documentation on file to be able to prove that it does meet the criteria and is aligned to current state standards. In terms of whether or not I discourage or encourage an independent adoption, I don't really have a formal stance on it. I really think that it's up to the district to determine what their local needs are and what materials meet the local needs the best. I do think that in terms of a streamlined process and in terms of contracting related to prices, purchasing from the ODE list is often a lot more efficient for districts. Performing an independent adoption and comprehensively reviewing materials in general can be quite a heavy lift, takes quite a bit of time and in some cases resources. So it really is up to the district to decide what resources and time they have available and whether or not they're able to perform an independent adoption in the period of time that's allowed by the Division 22 process. Which actually leads me into my next slide, which is that we are here at ODE to help you through the independent adoption process as much as we can. So we do have some resources that are available for districts when conducting independent adoptions. The adoption criteria documents are listed on the ODE instructional materials webpage. There's a link to that webpage within the slide deck, which is why you see a little bit of a darker shade of white or a lighter shade of blue for that first bullet point. And you'll have access to all of those criteria documents that are current and up to date on that webpage. The next thing that we're able to provide are evaluation committee training materials, as well as facilitation guides for consensus discussions. A consensus model is what we use at Oregon Department of Education when our evaluation teams are reviewing the materials and determining whether or not they should recommend. In some cases, you'll see that those training materials are readily available on the adopted materials webpage for ODE. In some cases, it looks like the instructional materials coordinators for previous years were not able to link the training materials directly to the page. This may have been something that occurred as we were moving towards an accessible web model. So I am working, one, to get the training materials for world languages up on the webpage for adopted instructional materials. That should be ready and available for districts by next week. I'm also looking back in the archive of instructional materials adoptions to put together the pieces and make available the training materials that were used for previous adoptions if they're not currently listed. In addition to those training materials, we have what are called IMET, instructional materials evaluation tools. There are two versions of that we use. One is an individual version and the other is the group version. So at ODE, the way that we model our evaluation is we allow individual evaluators time to work through the materials and score the materials as an individual. So they're able to come to the consensus conversations with a thorough background of what the materials include, as well as what they have scored the materials in their individual evaluation. When we move into those group discussions, it becomes a consensus conversation model. And the only real difference between those two IMET is that the group IMET has space for high quality feedback statements. And these statements allow evaluators to document where they find that the materials do not meet the criteria. For ODE, that's especially important because we send those comments back to publishers and they have a chance, before the next adoption cycle to really take those comments into consideration as they're developing new models or new editions of their materials. In the case of the group consensus discussions on a district level, I would think that extra space is just helpful for the documentation that is required of an independent adoption. So you can use that high quality feedback column as a way of documenting how the materials and on which page or in which chapter the materials meet each quality indicator in the criteria set by the State Board of Education. And lastly, most importantly, to me at least, most importantly, is that I'm here to support districts however I possibly can. Through the independent adoption process or through procuring materials off of the state list. There's an open door of communication. Always feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I'm happy to support or answer any questions that I can to make this process more efficient for you on a district level. I'll pause a second and make sure we don't have any lingering questions in the chat. Great. So, oops. Give me 1 second. I'm clicking buttons all over the place here. All right, we'll reshare that screen. So one of the large conversations that is occurring currently, and a lot of the questions that I receive, is related to the idea of whether or not a material is basal or whether it's supplemental. In Oregon, as you can see, based on this administrative rule on the slide, we define instructional material as any organized system which constitutes the major instructional vehicle for a given course of study or any part thereof. And at the state level and in Oregon, only basal instructional materials or instructional programs may be adopted by the State Board of Education. And this means that we do not review or recommend supplemental materials or intervention materials. We only look at what are considered basal instructional materials when conducting a review of publisher submitted materials or open educational resources that are submitted to the department for review and recommendation. This also does include electronic, internet, or web-based materials and media. So if you have a digital flex text, or if you have a comprehensive online program, similar to a lot of the programs we see being used for distance learning, those programs are considered to be instructional materials. And this administrative rule also means that basal instructional materials must be adopted by a district in order to meet the requirement for Division 22 related to instructional materials. So we'll go ahead and do a little bit of a breakdown between basal and supplemental. So basal materials are often referred to as core materials or core curriculum. But at the heart of basal, they're intended to be a substantial and ongoing component of instruction. And as I just mentioned, districts are required to adopt basal instructional materials in order to teach to the academic content standards. So basal instructional materials are often in people's mind, they say print textbooks. The print textbooks that we're used to purchasing and putting in front of students, those are basal. Digital versions of those textbooks are also considered to be basal. They're just transferred into a digital format. Next, as I mentioned on the previous slide, any adaptive or personalized learning programs. A good example would be programs such as Edgenuity or Acellus. Those are considered to be basal instructional materials, and they should be reviewed under an independent adoption process or be purchased off of the list at ODE. At ODE, we do not review any materials that encompass all of the content areas because of our rigid 7-year cycle that's based in content areas. But in a world where districts wanted to purchase materials that house all content areas in one program, they would need an independent adoption to be performed. So yes, Jennifer, the answer to your question is if your district decided to pursue Florida virtual, if the virtual academy is considered to be a public school, it's not considered to be a charter school, then you would need to perform the full instructional materials adoption process in order to implement Florida virtual as the basal instructional material within the district or within that program. For supplemental materials, materials that are used in conjunction with the basal instructional material of a course are considered to be supplemental. So these contain resources to supplement and or differentiate instruction that is the core instruction for most students in the classroom. So these materials may include articles that a teacher decides to supplement their basals with, audio clips, films, novels, as well as intervention materials. If they're materials that are used to supplement the instruction that a student is getting within their classroom that the majority of their students and their classmates are receiving, then that would be considered supplemental as well. So intervention programs are not reviewed on a state level, and we do not recommend them on a state level, but we do welcome districts to do reviews of those supplemental materials specifically for intervention materials prior to implementing them in the classroom. It's important to note that although it's been a large point of confusion for many districts navigating distance learning regarding digital instructional materials and the materials that they're using during distance learning, is that instructional materials are not the same as learning management systems. They often interact with one another, but like implementing Google Classroom as your learning management system doesn't need to go through any sort of review or adoption process. It's just the curriculum that's being used within that learning management system. And I do want to, especially in light of Jennifer's question, I want to point out that we do understand that the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic and shifting to virtual learning models did not allow a lot of time or space for performing an independent adoption of these materials. I do just think it's important in terms of understanding basal and supplemental that we note that any robust learning program that includes all of those content areas and serves as the core instructional vehicle for a classroom should adhere to all administrative rules related to instructional materials. So you would want to go through either an independent adoption process, or you would want to ensure that the materials are present on Oregon Department of Education's list. I'm going to pause for 1 second to check the chat. That's a great question, Jennifer. I would have to do a little bit more research if you want to email me with the exact language. But in in terms of if it's a full curriculum that would be considered basal, then yes, you're going to want to make sure an independent adoption is performed specifically so that you have that checklist that shows that it adheres to the adoption criteria. If there are just lessons that need to be implemented throughout the course of the learning of a student in a classroom, then those might actually be considered supplemental. I know that the SB 13 lessons, for example, are considered to be supplemental to instructional materials. So send me an email and I'll go ahead and check in on that exactly, and we'll come up to an answer for you. All right. So now the star of the show, I know a lot of you are here for, are some updates on our recent and upcoming adoptions on a state level. The first is the world languages adoption. So in February of 2020, the world languages criteria was adopted by the State Board of Education. And it's important to note that there's a shift for world languages. Typically, you all are used to looking at adoption criteria that is organized by grade band or grade level. In this case, the world languages adoption criteria is organized by the ACTFL proficiency levels. And this was a choice that was made during the development process to ensure that there was a little bit more flexibility for districts in selecting materials. It also helped us to ensure that the materials that were sent in by publishers were able to fit into the categories in a way that allowed them to bid so that there were more options on the list for districts to select from. Yes, absolutely. The world languages criteria is organized by proficiency levels instead of by grade band. So what you'll see is category 1 is usually elementary, category K through 5. In this case, for world languages, it's going to be levels 1 and 2. So the materials within category 1 can be taught to proficiency levels 1 and 2. So an example of this would be materials in category 1 would fit into a Spanish 1 classroom environment, regardless of whether or not they are in high school or in middle school. You'll just want to look at the specific material to be able to ensure that they meet the need of the grade band that you're procuring materials for. All right. The languages that we reviewed during the summer when we had our evaluation process were Chinese, French, and Spanish. We, as an agency, moved forward only reviewing these 3 languages for a few reasons. The first reason is that the materials that were submitted by publishers were the most robust within those 3 languages. A good example of this is that we had one curriculum or one instructional material that was submitted by a publisher in German, but the fees that we would have obtained from that publisher to review the materials did not cover the cost of convening an evaluation team. So in the case that we didn't have multiple instructional materials for a language to review, we decided to move forward by not reviewing that language. In addition, we did do our due diligence at ODE by looking at the data of languages that were taught within school districts in Oregon. And we found that Chinese, French, and Spanish had the highest course enrollments. So we wanted to make sure that there were materials on the list for those 3 language categories. In the case that your district teaches a language outside of those that were reviewed by the Department of Education, you're going to want to perform an independent adoption prior to implementing new materials. So if the German materials, for example, that you have currently meet the adoption criteria set by the state board, You're just going to want to perform an independent adoption, indicating that the materials are current and they meet the current standards set by the State Board of Education. If you want to procure new materials, you'll also do that independent adoption process and make sure that checklist is on file on a district level to ensure that the materials are aligned and are up to date. And in November, we got approval from the State Board of Education for our world languages list. And that list is now live on the ODE Adopted Materials webpage. The contract period just began on February 1st, so those contracts are good to go. And you can reach out to, my recommendation is to reach out to Northwest Textbook Depository first if you do find that there are materials on our list that you're interested in. If you don't find that there are materials on our list that meet your needs, then go ahead and reach out to publishers to see what materials are available for you so that you can get started on the process of an independent adoption. And as I mentioned, I'll be sending this slide deck out after the presentation, so you'll have access to these pertinent links that are embedded within the slide deck. All right. Moving on to English language arts. English language arts instructional materials review and adoption was postponed from 2020 to 2021 due to delays related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're on track to conduct this adoption and to review materials, review materials in July of this year. And if you would like to be considered, or you have an educator on a district level or at your school that you would like to recommend be a part of our ELA evaluation team, send me an email with your contact information or their contact information, and I'll make sure that the application for the evaluation committee hits the inbox that it's meant to hit. So we do have criteria for ELA. That criteria was adopted in 2020 and it has not changed. And then we will review in July of this year and send our recommended list to the State Board of Education for adoption in October. And one of the points of confusion I've found in my new role is that we don't post the list on our website for adopted instructional materials until February. And we wait until the contract period begins in order to make that list available on our website. That being said, once it's been approved by the State Board of Education, you are more than welcome to send me an email and say, hey, I saw the list was approved. Can you send it to us so we can get a head start on our adoption and procurement process? And I am more than happy to do that. So if you find that when we get to the ELA adoption coming up, it hits October, November, the list isn't posted on the website, then send me an email and I will make sure that you have access to the score sheets, the price sheets, and our list of recommendations on a state level. Moving into English language proficiency, very similar schedule. The only thing that is changed here is the adoption criteria. So as I mentioned, due to the delay of ELA, there was adoption criteria that had been formally approved by the state board, and then we had to go ahead and pause on the review process and recommendation process. In the case of English language proficiency, there was a short delay. Typically, we have our adoption criteria approved by state board in January. In this case, we had to transfer a traditionally in-person process to a virtual process where we developed criteria over Zoom. Lots of fun. We're all learning the Zoom world these days. So we will be presenting the first draft of that criteria next week on Thursday, February 18th to the State Board of Education. We'll receive their feedback and move for adoption in March of this year. So March, we'll have the adoption criteria ready for publishers and districts. We will review the content for English language proficiency in July of this year. We usually do our training in June, give it 2 weeks so that our evaluators have time to really make themselves comfortable with the information prior to beginning the review in July. And in October, we will bring that list of recommendations for English language proficiency materials to the state board for approval and have the procurement process and contracting process start from there. Yes, I just received a question in the chat. So districts will usually use the materials that they currently have implemented. I've received some questions in my inbox about ELA. I know that for some districts, it's been very inconvenient because their contract might have expired. My recommendation would to get in touch with the publisher of your purchased materials and try to extend by 1 year. You should be able to extend that contract by 1 year. And then, yes, you'll want to start the process of procuring new materials to be implemented for ELA by fall of 2022 is the date there. And if you need any more information about the contracting process or the timeline, feel free to send me an email and I'd be happy to help. All right. This might be my favorite part of the presentation, Oregon Open Learning. So the Oregon Department of Education has a new initiative, a project we've been working on, which is the Oregon Open Learning Hub. And the Oregon Open Learning Hub is an OER, or Open Educational Resource Depository, where districts, educators, really anybody who'd like to can go onto that hub and they're able to find a collection of open educational resources that are openly licensed to use by districts. Some of the resources have different open licensing types. So you'll see an array of different resources. Some of them are ready to use and should be used as they are uploaded to the hub. Other resources you're welcome to remix and revise so that they are applicable to your local context. So if you want more information about open licensing and what it means to use those open educational resources, we have professional learning resources on our hub within our professional learning group. Or you can go ahead and email Oregon Open Learning at ode.state.or.us. And our Oregon Open Learning team is happy to come and hold a workshop with your district to teach about open educational resources, as well as give more information about curating and using resources that are currently housed on the hub. The hub contains over 50,000 openly licensed resources, and they're all searchable by the OER Commons taxonomy. So they break down the search function by subject, by grade level, and for me, one of the most interesting and important ways that they filter their information is by standards. So you're able to, if you have a material, let's just say that your textbook, you don't feel adequately meets a certain standard, like the lesson that they have, you just feel like it could be better, then you're able to go on to OER Commons and search for lessons based off of that standard. And the OER Commons, or Oregon Open Learning Hub system, will provide you a list of lessons that are aligned to that content standard that you're able to use to supplement your basal instructional materials. March 1st through 6th is Open Education Week. And during Open Education Week, we will be hosting a few different events for educators and for district administrators related to OER and related to Oregon Open Learning. I will go ahead and drop this bit.ly link in the chat. And this link is just a flyer for districts. You can feel free to share it with your colleagues or share it with your networks on a district level. And it outlines the events that we have planned. So we have OER workshops, and that really is the perfect introduction to the Oregon Open Learning Hub. We cover some licensing questions. We cover our 3 touchstones, which are equity, empowerment, and efficacy. And we also talk a little bit about how to explore the hub. In addition to those events, we have what are called curation conventions. And you're welcome to join that either just as a participant to watch and see what those sessions include, or we welcome you if you're ready to just jump in and start curating resources on the hub. So I welcome and encourage all of you to share those resources and share those engagements. And we look forward to seeing you there. I'm on the Oregon Open Learning team, so you'll get to see this mug again if you attend that workshop. All right, lots of information, short period of time. We have about 10 minutes left. I will monitor the chat or feel free to unmute. And I am here to answer questions for the next 10 minutes. Otherwise, you will be receiving a follow-up email with pertinent links and resources right after this session. It will take me a little bit of time to convert the recording, but as soon as I do, I will send that follow-up. And I look forward to either, getting a call from you or seeing your name in my email inbox. I hope to support you and your district however I can. Thanks for attending today, and I will stay on the line to answer any questions.